Good evening, ladies and gentlemen. Welcome to the 11th Jaipur Literature Festival, and we are right here at AU Bank Samvad. Please welcome our speakers for the Wodehouse effect. Philip Norman, Shashi Tharoor is on his way. Swapan Dasgupta in conversation with Amrita Tripathi. The session is presented by Amity University. A big, loud round of applause for our speakers. Thank you.
Okay, I suppose while we wait for Shashi to arrive, it might be nice to know how many of you are PG Wodehouse fans. That's incredible. Okay, good one. So we hopefully will get lots of questions, audience questions in. Do we know where Shashi is? How far he is?
He's on his way.
Okay. Okay. Dead air, or should we chat? We all want to start. Okay, so I think I'm going to start with, you obviously know Philip Norman, Swapan Dasgupta, Shashi Tharoor is on his way. I'm going to start by asking Philip Norman, who on this panel is actually, he's someone who has met P.G. Wodehouse, who has interviewed him, who had a delightful series of correspondence with him. And also, P.G. Wodehouse wrote a lovely blurb for your first novel.
Yes, he did. I didn't deserve it.
Let me just start by asking you a little bit about the man before we get to the writing, because you did say, interestingly, he was a bit different from what maybe you would have expected from reading his work.
Absolutely. I wrote to him in 1969. He was 87, still hard at work, and asked if I could come and see him in Long Island. He lived in a...
Oh, sorry, can you not hear? Just put this a bit closer to me.
A little louder. He lived in a rural part of Long Island called Remsenburg, and I got a handwritten note back saying, that's fine, gave me directions of how to get there on the bus from New York. I got off the bus and there was this very tall, amiable man in baggy flannel trousers that I hadn't seen anywhere since about 1929, and a little scatty woman next to him. And that was Wodehouse and his wife, Ethel, known as Bunny. They drove me to their house. Ethel drove, and she hit the curb all the time. We bounced rather than drove to Wodehouse's house, where I sat and talked to him for quite a long while. And there was no trace in this very nice, sweet man of the genius who could write something like Bingo spun around like an adagio dancer who has been caught watering the cat's milk, or ice formed on the upper slopes of the Butler. It all happened on the page. There was no trace of it in Pelham Grenville Wodehouse. Anyway, I saw he was actually starting to nod off at one point. This has happened to me. I've actually nodded off while interviewing somebody, but I've never actually had it happen while I'm interviewing somebody, until PG. And Ethel came in and said, now you'll have to go because Plummy, he was known as Plummy, wants to watch his serial. He watched a dreadful soap opera called Edge of Night every day. And I said, well, please, could I stay until after he's watched it? She said, well, we've got Guy Bolton coming to dinner tonight. Guy Bolton was Wodehouse's collaborator on many musical comedies. Wodehouse wrote a lot for the Broadway stage. He even wrote a really great timeless song that was used in Showboat. A song called Bill was by Wodehouse. So I managed to stay to dinner. Bunny said, you can stay if you decant the wine. I said, of course I'd decant the wine. She showed me into the kitchen. So I was in P.G. Wodehouse's kitchen all on my own with 2 bottles of Mathias Rosé that I was supposed to decant, which of course, as you know, is fizzy. And by the time I'd finished decanting it, it wasn't fizzy anymore. And finally, Guy Bolton, his longtime collaborator, arrived, and the really amazing part was having dinner with Bunny Wodehouse, P.G. Wodehouse, Guy and Virginia Bolton. And the whole dinner was about how much they'd got paid in their career and how much Virginia's previous husband had got for discovering the wonder dog Rin Tin Tin. And Wodehouse said, you realize that dog was on $6,000 a week and a percentage of the film. However, anyway, I went back again. That particular time I had asked, I'd said, I've read all your book except one, which is called A Prefect's Uncle, which was one of his early school stories. He took me into his little study where he also slept, actually. They slept apart. And he took a copy of this book down and autographed it and handed it to me. And that was pretty amazing. When I went back, I found myself in his little study again. And as we were walking along the shelves, he said, "Oh, this is an interesting little thing I wrote." He was barely more than a teenager. It was called The Swoop. It's like an early little sort of pastiche about how a Boy Scout saves England from invasion by the Germans in 1909. So rather prophetic. And he pulled it out of the shelf and he autographed that too and gave it to me. When he died, later I found out that he didn't actually, that was his only copy of that book. He only had a Xerox copy after that. Subsequently, I took the QE2 back from New York. These were good days for journalists, as you can imagine. And waiting in my cabin, I was hoping there would be a message in lipstick on the mirror, as Monty Bodkin finds in The Luck of the Bodkins, saying, "Hi, sweetie." But instead, there was something better. There was a box of cigars with a little card saying, "With love from Plum and Bunny Wodehouse." After that, we corresponded, and he gave me, as you say, a lovely quote from my first novel, which I never deserved.
Well, I mean, apart from that, that's a lovely story. I'm glad that we got to hear that from you. I see Shashi is making his way to the stage. Swapan, I do want to ask you.
I just want to ask a question, which has always intrigued me. There's been so much controversy over P.G. Wodehouse remaining behind in France
The German
in
chapter.
1940. And there's always been said that it's partly because he never wanted to be parted from his dogs. Now, how true is that story?
It's not true. No, he was actually interned by the Germans.
No, but
Yeah.
the reason why he didn't leave.
Oh, he didn't leave? No, it was just he didn't take it seriously.
There we go. Okay, we're going to come to the German chapter. Hi. I've put, yes. We have Shashi and Swapan sitting next to each other, so maybe some fisticuffs. But we had to start off. We had a delightful story about Plummy and Ethel or Bunny. Philip Norman has met P.G. Wodehouse. I'm going to ask Swapan to go, and then Shashi to take us through a little bit of your favorite Wodehouse moments, reading Wodehouse, and then we'll get into some of the meat of the discussion, including the German chapter, because that was, of course, a blight on his reputation for a while. We can clear some of that up. And I'm also really delighted it's not just an old boys club. We have loads of people here who have questions about P.G. Wodehouse, and we're going to try and talk about the sexism angle if there is one. But Swapan, to start with, sexism. Oh. Apparently there's no sex whatsoever, Mr. Norman tells me. That we'll come to that. But I think the last chat y'all did, there was some questions on sexism, so we'll come to that. What do you like best about Wodehouse? Any memories growing up reading Wodehouse, or any favorite lines?
Look, Amrita, I think the larger question we need to address, and which I've found always a little perplexing, is why are so many people here to celebrate a writer who actually epitomizes eccentricity, a sort of Englishness which no longer exists, which probably never really existed, but will it really exist in the imagination of people? Why? Why in India? I can understand why some people in Dulwich College might actually celebrate P.G. Wodehouse as distinguished alumni. I believe the college still keeps the tiny corner of a library which he used as a sort of a memorial for him. What is it? And secondly, why is it that the popularity of P.G. Wodehouse in India actually is more a post-independence phenomena? That's something which I think we
Would you like me to answer that?
I see the shake of the head. Well, do you want to tell us?
Yes, I will. The first thing about Wodehouse, which was recognized not just by, he was an enormously popular writer who earned a huge amount of money, particularly before the Second World War, in America as well as in Britain, also from writing for Broadway. Hugely popular and yet respected by other writers as diverse as George Orwell, and Evelyn Waugh was not given to effusive compliments to anybody. Evelyn Waugh described him as the head of my profession. He is known as the master because of the wonderful things he could do with the English language. The English language, he would take a cliche that everybody used and would just give it such wonderful newness. as when Rupert Baxter, the efficient secretary of Lord Emsworth, has committed some blunder, and Emsworth is fuming. And Wodehouse, in an aside, said it wasn't exactly the sack, but he seemed to hear the beating of its wings. That's pure Wodehouse. Or another time when Bertie, who is always ruminating, he's over quotations. Bertie wakes up in bed and says, good morning, good night, good evening, Jeeves. And Jeeves said, good morning, sir. Morning? It's very dark outside. We are in autumn, sir, you will recollect. Season of mists and mellow fruitfulness. Season of what? Of mists, sir, and mellow fruitfulness. So all sorts of sort of little scraps of learning are always coming through and being made wonderfully silly by Wodehouse. Wodehouse is in the great tradition of the clever English people being really silly. It's no accident that Wodehouse once met W.S. Gilbert of Gilbert and Sullivan, and he said he wasn't very funny, actually. He said there was a certain kind of wasp that followed him around. I don't think that was very funny. So even Wodehouse was disappointed in Gilbert. So we shouldn't be too troubled that Wodehouse was only funny on the page, as clearly Gilbert was only funny on the page.
Yeah, and he's been called the supreme example of the master craftsman, the master writer. Many of us know, I think, Wodehouse through Stephen Fry and Hugh Laurie, the Jeeves and, for us, epitomizing Jeeves and Wooster. And I'm the only person in this panel who can't pull off the accent and the lines. So I'm going to ask you to do a couple, but also to talk about what's
But let me answer Chopin first,
Yeah.
because I think he's raised an important question. I think the reason that Wodehouse, and Chopin, he was equally popular before independence. Yes, I've recounted the story that I heard from my former mother-in-law about the fact that when Lord Mountbatten came to stay at the residence of the governor of Bengal, or was it the governor of Orissa at the time, that is my wife's grandfather, that it was the young Indian girl who introduced him to the works of P.G. Wodehouse. He was unfamiliar, whereas the Indian nationalist, Kailash Nath Karju, who was the governor, had read all of Wodehouse's books and had the entire collection. So Indians read Wodehouse before. But to answer Chopin's question, I would say that it's precisely the fact that Wodehouse's world is this never, never land, a world which may not have existed outside his imagination, but which he conjured up so delightfully and with all the delights of language that Philip Norman has alluded to. That meant that you could actually get into the spirit of Wodehouse without any of the anxiety of allegiance, that loyalty to other British writing with all its dreary socio-economic specificities and political commitments would have implied. In the case of Wodehouse, you sort of needed a passport, and that was the English language. But you didn't need the visa of actually wanting in any way to admire or resenting being excluded from that world, because that world essentially didn't exist. It was the comic hall humor of the stage transported onto the printed page. The plotting was hilarious. The language was superb. I mean, Philip Norman's come up with a couple of lines. I have my own favorites, because they used to subvert the possibilities of the language in ways that I think Indians would find particularly enjoyable, because we were taught that English had to be done and written and spoken and read in a certain way. And here was this great English writer taking the mickey out of the language. So,
so there's a lot of sending up also of society, right? Of taking the piss when it comes to aristocracy, sorry for the language. But you were the president of a Wodehouse Society. Do you want to tell us?
I helped revive the way. There used to be a Wodehouse Society in St. Stephen's in the 60s, which would have definitely been the first ever Wodehouse Society in the world, which unfortunately had faded for whatever reason, subsided into silence. And when I came to college, I discovered that there had been a society and didn't exist anymore. So I set about finding out how to revive it. And I was only a fresher. I was simply too junior to do these dramatic things. So I got somebody a year senior who agreed to serve as president of the revived society. I was the secretary. And we had a great time. And in fact, for a while, I would argue that Wodehouse Society became an institution in college. I even wrote a letter to P.G. Wodehouse on the official letterhead of the Wodehouse Society, complete with curly-tailed pig. But, writing to Wodehouse was like offering a souffle to Bocuse. It just had to be perfect. And it never was, of course. Every draft I wrote, I just felt it wasn't good enough to send it. And I finally never did send the letter. And then when the news came that he'd passed away, on Valentine's Day, I think it was in mid-February 1975. It really a deep pall and gloom settled over me, not least because I hadn't had the courage to send him that letter.
Yeah.
I think it's worth saying, if I may, that there is a period, there is a definite period in Wodehouse, but it's the 1880s and 1890s. And Bertie Wooster is the archetype of what used to be called a knut, K-N-U-T, or a masher, or a stage door Johnny. That's a wealthy young fellow with nothing in his head.
But did the young men in spats actually ever wear spats? Even
So
I'm told that some German spies were uncovered because they learned their British manners from
a spy
Wodehouse.
was parachuted into the fence
Wearing spats.
Wearing spats,
Exactly.
yes.
Promptly
And asking the way
arrested.
to the Drones Club.
Okay.
And Wodehouse always rather sort of liked the thought of being one of these mashers or nuts or stage door Johnnies. And a lot of the slang that Bertie uses is slang from the 1890s. Bertie will sometimes say that when he likes something, something is really oojar come spiff, which means good, or tinkety-tonk when he says goodbye.
Toodaloo.
Toodaloo sort of lasted, but tinkety-tonk
still
never
exists.
made it beyond the Great War.
In your circle, trouble.
Well, I mean, okay, Swapan, to bring you into this. You have said in the past, though, and I think we want to see a show of hands again of Wodehouse fans. Still resonant, still relevant in modern India. I mean, it was a time that never really existed. But, as Philip was saying earlier, that, he did write also for an American audience. Now we have these sort of parallels when it comes to, say, Downton Abbey. Like, there seems to be this nostalgia for a time that, say, Indians aren't necessarily, it's not been part of our culture, except for the dreadful aunts, the palaces, the sort of feudal setup, perhaps. Do you think it's still relevant today?
Well, I have a slightly different interpretation of Wodehouse's appeal from Shashi's. And we were talking about Wodehouse. You must remember that along with Wodehouse, another person who had a similar sort of appeal and who was far more contentious was actually Kipling.
Oh, not a similar appeal at all.
Shashi,
Oh my
Shashi,
God, the
you've
baggage
written
that Kipling carried.
Shashi, you've written a book on the empire. There's no need to flog it today.
They've all, I
Yeah,
think they're all
they've sold
aware.
very well.
But you can't possibly put
No.
Kipling and Wodehouse in the same breath.
We had a session on Kipling in the front
One is a
lawns about 2
flatulent
years
voice
ago.
of Victorian imperialism. The other one is a guy who
And I-
pricks
and
the
I think-
balloons of
and I
imperialism.
think
Does
that
anybody
one
out
of
there
the
want to hear
reasons
about Wodehouse or these two?
Why Wodehouse is extremely popular, and you're quite right, you didn't require a passport, you didn't require a visa, partly because a very large number of people in India, familiar with the English language, actually took Wodehouse as his own, as our own. Yeah. That's the whole point. And I think there was a deep admiration at one level. And this is the schizoid feeling as to why Kailash Nath Kadju, a hardened congressman, could also empathize with a setting, an imagery, a La La Land, a Never Never Land of a Britain which probably never existed. Because there was an idea of Britain which was devoid of the empire. And that was the Britain. And that respect, admiration, even love for that Britain. Oh, if only they hadn't colonized us.
I think you'll have to look very, very carefully through the entire works of Wodehouse, which amount to more than 100 books, to find any mention whatsoever of any empire whatsoever.
There's one line about Mahatma Gandhi I can quote.
Wodehouse knew when he first wrote the character of Bertie Wooster and Jeeves's first line, as Wodehouse told me, he never thought would lead to immortality. Bertie says, "I'm off to New York, Jeeves," and Jeeves says, "Very good, sir, which suit will you wear?" Now, there is no sort of inkling of comic immortality in that. Wodehouse knew at that time that his world was out of date. What he found was that the Americans loved hearing about. He wrote for the Saturday Evening Post magazine, which paid him a huge amount of money, and he wrote about his butlers and his young men, stage door Johnnies, Bertie Wooster, Knuts, Mashers, for the Americans. And he wrote about American gangsters and Hollywood producers and Hollywood ne'er-do-wells for the English market. He was a truly international writer. And he says nobody seems to mind. In this world, never did. He only knew one butler in his whole life, actually. And when he employed a domestic servant at this little house in Remsenburg, it was a maid, as they called her. And her great line that Ethel Wodehouse still quoted was, "If you want anything else, just holler." That's a long way from Beach the butler, the stately procession of one, as Wodehouse calls him.
But, Philip, to ask you a little bit about Wodehouse the person, because he had this dreadful chapter towards the end where obviously, when he was interned in Nazi Germany, doing these broadcasts, and I think a lot of people who are fans will be familiar with this period, he could never set foot in Britain, in England again. He went to New York after that, and it seems that he didn't really think through what he was doing, that he was playing into the sort of propaganda machine. Is he more Worcester than anyone else?
He admitted to me he was Lord Emsworth, who is described as Lord Emsworth is as happy as a fluffy-minded man with excellent health and a large income can be. But there was something about him, and I think it's something on the autism spectrum. He didn't really relate to other people. He only really felt strongly about one woman in his life. That was his stepdaughter, Leonora, Ethel's daughter by a first marriage. There was a slight precedent for the German chapter which sort of shows the same quality, where he goes to Hollywood in the early 30s, and he's not asked to write a script. So he stays in his bungalow writing the next novel, and then the Los Angeles Times sends a woman to interview him. He says, "Well, I don't know why they're paying me $50,000 a week, because I'm not doing anything at all." And he was really surprised with a huge furore that caused. The German thing, there's a great misunderstanding about the German chapter. There's also a big problem that no one ever talks about Wodehouse in Germany. The chapter was that he was interned, but he was 59. He was released when he was 59 after being in a lunatic asylum, internment camp, in Upper Silesia. And he remarked, "If this is Upper Silesia, what must Lower Silesia be like?" But he was released and he went to Berlin, where he had considerable amount of money because he sold books in Germany. And there were German officers that he'd met who said they really enjoyed his work, and it was very difficult. And he was asked to make a series of broadcasts over the CBS American network before America had entered the Second World War, to his American readers to say that he was okay. He made these broadcasts, which was sort of light, comic, vain Wodehouse, really sort of taking the mickey out of the Germans. They've since been held up as examples of how to subvert people without really knowing the people knowing. The trouble was that they were repeated over the German network and picked up in Britain. And the war had changed in the time when Wodehouse, when he was interned, people were still saying, "Oh, the Germans are quite decent sort of chaps, really." And 1941 and the fall of France, and no one felt that way at all about Germans anymore. And Duff Cooper, politician, hired a journalist called W.D. Connor to assassinate Wodehouse on the BBC, in fact, which he did, saying that he made the last and greatest sale of his life, that of his own country. It was a dreadful piece of awful, awful slander, libel or slander, whichever you wish. Being Wodehouse, after the war, he met Connor, known as Cassandra, and they became friends. Because Wodehouse couldn't really feel badly about anybody. The big problem about Wodehouse in the war, he was finally released, he went to Paris. He was interrogated by MI5 in the person of Malcolm Muggeridge, one of the most astringent journalists who ever worked in Britain, who realized he was only guilty of naivety, but a kind of awful naivety. Orwell said the same, and so did Evelyn Waugh. But what nobody really knows is he then was given hospitality by a German woman, highly born German woman. She said, "Come and stay with me, I'll look after you," before he met up with Ethel. And he spent that time adapting one of his novels for a German film studio. Now that is really sort of, as the French would say, insensible. It is somewhere on the autism spectrum, I feel.
Shashi, what would you say to this? I mean, in this era where we, of course, see outrage every moment, and, I think everyone in the, it's something we see. Is there space for naivete when you're talking about one of the literary greats? Do you think that if he was alive today, his legacy would have survived? I think there was a lot of work done to, reclaim his reputation. He was knighted towards the end of his life.
Yeah, no, the trolls would have obviously gone after him on social media forever, but the point is that fortunately he didn't live in that era. I think on that particular episode, Philip Norman has summarized it so effectively and well. I don't really want to dwell on that. I think we didn't spend enough time on his use of language,
You're
which
supposed to
was
give us some lines.
actually so extraordinarily special. As I said, in some ways, he sort of, by reminding us of the canons of English literature, he subverted them as well. So when you have, he groaned slightly and winced, like Prometheus watching his vulture drop in for lunch. Or the one of my favorites of all time is, he said, unlike the male codfish, which upon finding itself the parent of 2,900,000 little codfish, cheerfully resolves to love them all, the British aristocracy is apt to look with a somewhat jaundiced eye upon its younger sons, whom of course they sent off to India to rule us. That kind of thing. There's another one in that vein was, she reminded him of one of those portraits of the mistresses of Bourbon kings, which confirmed that the men who married them were either men of iron, impervious to fear, or else short-sighted.
There's someone else who's described as who's rather stout. He said he looked like he'd been poured into his clothes and forgotten to say when.
Swapan, do you have any?
Well, I think, when you're talking about naivety, as far as Wodehouse is concerned, I think the man somehow corresponded to the characters he created. All of them, whether it's Lord Emsworth, whether it's Gussie Fink Nottle and his interminable newts, whether it's Bertie Wooster, I mean, they're all people who create a world for themselves which have very little to do with the outside world. So if that is an autism spectrum, they were guilty in some way or the other of that. So Wodehouse, in a sense, to what extent had he internalized these make-believe characters and completely lost sight of politics? And as far as his appeal in the United States is concerned, I think one of the remarkable features of the United States is that what a tremendous amount of premium, social premium, they attach to anything which remotely sounds English. There is nothing more. There is a big cachet in the United States in speaking with an English accent, as a lot of the English actors and actresses have done.
A lot of freeloaders in New York are still doing, yes. Yes. Don't forget, though, Roderick Spode, the fascist.
I think Roderick Spode is a great guy. Roderick Spode, who in his spare time secretly runs a shop, Eulalie, which sells women's lingerie, and is very, and I think what Bertie said about him, what a fatuous oaf, I think they called him.
Did you ever in your puff see such a perfect Paris shirt?
Wearing,
And that sort of, wasn't it kind of a send-off of Oswald Mosley and the black shirts and so on? It was just, it was very clever. He did have one reference to the empire in a short story in 1935, in which he said, if only Mahatma Gandhi would sit down to some good Stilton cheese and roly-poly pudding, we'd have an end to all this nonsense of civil disobedience. But the fact is, of course, that it was meant to elicit laughter, not agreement.
Yeah, not outrage like today. So I'm going to take a couple of questions off Twitter. Some of them are non-political and some are very decidedly political. TCA Raghavan tweeting us, why did Wodehouse do so few school stories? Who wants to take this?
He did many school. He started off writing school stories. His great model was a writer in Victorian times called Talbot Baines Reed, who was hugely successful, which were school stories which were in another enclosed, rather idyllic world, and yet were realistic. And so Wodehouse started writing for a publication called The Captain, that line. So I'm afraid it would be beyond his ken, this particular controversy.
Let me ask you also, all of you, in terms of his portrayal of women, right? You have the formidable aunts. A couple of people have pointed out to me this is something that many Indians would be familiar with as well. At any point, do you think that there is a sexist streak in this? I mean, I've asked you this.
Yes, well, I mean, when he talks about aunt calling to aunt like mastodons across a primeval swamp, there is certainly a hint of sexism there, I think.
I think so. Yes. I think so. But you did say, interestingly, there's no sex in the books. There's no reference to, except for one, perhaps?
Bertie Wooster, on one occasion, it's in a book which actually is, because Wodehouse was a great classical student, and Latin and Greek, that's why he can do these things with the language. You have to master the rules before you can break them. It's like Picasso is the same. And there is a moment in this book when Bertie finds a young woman in his bed wearing heliotrope pajamas. And his little soliloquy says, the attitude to chaps who find girls in their beds wearing heliotrope pajamas varies. Some like it, some don't. I don't.
Of course, not to
He did
conflate
have
the two.
You remember the wonderful line about, like so many substantial men in America, what was it? He married early and often, leaping from blonde to blonde, like the chamois of the Alps springs from crag to crag.
Yes, yes.
So
In fact,
you do have a
Not
few.
loving that one.
You get a lot of chamois. There are repetitions of the chamois.
Swapan?
No, but
line.
most of Bertie Wooster's women characters are about formidable aunts. I mean, those are the ones which are memorable. Aunt
Well, there's
Agatha.
one that Aunt Dahlia, who has the chef Anatole, is a great sport.
Yeah, exactly.
But Aunt Agatha eats
Aunt Agatha or Mrs.
eats
Spencer
broken
Gregson,
bottles and
as she
wears
was called.
barbed wire
Terrifies
next
him.
to the skin.
You know, or you have women like Honoria Glossop.
Honoria Glossop, yes.
Yes.
She thinks the stars are God's daisy
God's
chain.
daisy chain.
Absolute rot, of course. They're nothing of the kind.
Okay, we have one more political question for you. Randhir asking, would Wodehouse approve of Swapan's or Tharoor's ideology? Who would Bertie or Jeeves prefer? To either of you?
Ask Woodhouse.
I don't really think he had an ideology, so I'm not sure he'd particularly
Okay.
approve or disapprove one way or the other.
Swapan?
No, I mean, what's this? I mean, what's the admiration of P.G. Wodehouse got to do with my voting preferences?
Who would he prefer?
I don't know.
I feel like this is the first time we're getting both of you to agree. We're going to take some questions, I think, and then intersperse that in our conversation.
He was a born conservative.
Yeah.
He was a born
he said
conservative.
politically naive, not really
Well,
given to...
Yeah, I don't know he was a conservative. He certainly hasn't expressed any conservative ideas in his correspondence, in his letters and so on. So I think you're making an assumption that's not warranted.
One strange moment in his correspondence, he discovers spiritualism. And he says to his friend Bill Townend, his sort of non-starter writer friend, who was always saying was a genius, have you heard of this spiritualism? Bill, it's the goods.
But just coming back to what you said about being a sort of master craftsman of language, I think again, Stephen Fry, my favorite, saying at one point, here's someone who used to read Shakespeare every year. And I think that a lot of possibly younger fans, a lot of younger readers didn't realize he did have that kind of learning and depth of knowledge about the greats. I mean, do you think
At
that...
one point, he says, I'm not one of those chaps who lets I dare not wait on I would like cats in adages. He's always kind of screwing them around, but they're there.
And then the mixed metaphors, which, as you said, you have a couple of examples.
Oh, yes. Well, there's one actually in here. Well, there's the sack. You can hear the beating of its wings. Oh, it's when Bertie tries to sing Sonny Boy at an East End concert, and Jeeves has arranged for everyone else to sing Sonny Boy on the programme before Bertie. And Bertie then says there's a sort of something going on. It's not quite the raspberry, but I seem to hear the beating of its wings. But then there's in a letter, in fact, he says he's talking about an Ascot water heater, a horrible old English kind of water heater. He says, everybody said the Ascot water heater was awful, but after a couple of days, I had it eating out of my hand.
I think one of the big problems, in India, we've confronted those of us who love P.G. Wodehouse. Irony, sarcasm, these are basically the stock in trade. People who love them, who love playing with the English language, who have an impish sense of humor, love Wodehouse. I would strongly recommend that at least in public life, those attributes are in remarkable short supply. I think Shashi would agree on that.
Yeah, and you know why they're in short supply? Because when you try and reveal those attributes, the country comes down on you like a ton of bricks. Not just the beating of the wings, it's the beating of the bricks on your head.
But you know,
So,
this is what a lot of people do say that Indians, we've seemed to have lost our sense of humor. But clearly, in terms of appreciating it, at least on the written word, and is this something you feel that we are losing our sense of humor? We're getting more thin-skinned. We're not appreciating.
We're certainly getting more thin-skinned. This is a nation that takes offense at the slightest provocation or lack thereof. It's also a country where the public expression of humor is fraught with peril, because there's always somebody who will take it seriously and make a huge fuss about it. On top of that, our public life is multilingual, which means that anything you say in one language, if it can be misunderstood when translated, you're better off not saying it. So my own experience...
As our old college friend has discovered.
For example.
Mr. Mani Shankar Iyer has discovered.
There's a funny glossary to a book by Richard Usborne, who was an author who looked like Wodehouse and wrote a book called Wodehouse at Work about the different translations of Wodehouse and how various languages tried to translate, for example, the phrase a bearded bozo. The French, un bon barbu. I also have to say that I did a talk a couple of days ago on the Beatles in the other space. Much more feedback coming from this audience than I got about the Beatles.
About the Beatles?
Yeah.
Ah, well.
That
I
says
think
something.
Wodehouse resonated more than the Beatles with this kind of crowd,
Yeah.
a book reading crowd. But you know, we did actually in Doordarshan in 1988 do an adaptation of a P.G. Wodehouse novel. I think it was Leave It to Smith, in which they replaced Blanding's castle with the Rajasthani palace of an indolent Maharaja, and they had the thing flopped completely. No one felt that the humor translated into the Indian context at all. I wasn't living in India at the time, but I read about it. It was a disaster.
I think it's because so much of it is commentary and not so. There is wonderful, sparkling dialogue, but it is as much interior monologue and commentary.
I think also, Shashi, you did a very great disservice, if I recall.
Oh, thank you.
In among other things, as transforming the Wodehouse Society at St. Stephen's into something of a society meant for practical jokes.
That was one of our many experiences.
While
We were honoring each of the various Wodehouse characters.
while it was great fun putting up women's underwear on the
Isn't that what shut it down?
Not in my time. Not in my
That's
time.
what shut it down.
The women's underwear was only when there were women in college. We didn't have any. Chopin, you forget so
No.
quickly.
So
the
these
chronology
guys
is
have
perfect.
managed to bring politics into a discussion about P.G. Wodehouse. Pretty good going.
No surprises there. Okay, wait. So you might as well explain that prank, and you have.
No. The Wodehouse Society, when we revived it, had a number of activities. We had a Lord Ickenham Memorial Mimicry competition, and we had a Galahad Threepwood practical joke competition, and we had various things. Lots of fun was had. We had a quiz competition with all sorts of things. I think, yes, it was a what's his name? Gussie Fink Knottle quiz competition, and so on. You know, who thought that the stars were God's daisy chain, etc. But anyway, to cut a long story short, the practical joke competition, some years after I had left college,
And
went
I had
awry.
left also, since we left at the same time.
Same time, went awry when somebody, I believe, because the college had gone co-educational in the meantime, and as part of the practical joke competition, women's underwear was found flying at half-mast from the crucifix on top of the college chapel. At which point the Wodehouse Society was shut down.
Disbanded.
Quite,
Never to be
quite
resurrected.
deservedly, I suppose.
However, the catch is I wrote the bylaws of the society, and every practical joke required advance clearance by the faculty advisor. So there should have been, that is, you know, all societies in college had to have a faculty advisor. So if the faculty advisor had approved this, then somebody should have been asking the faculty advisor to turn in his papers too. That's another matter.
I think we should take this to Parliament at some point. There's a Wodehouse Society in the making. Let's try and get some questions in because there are lots of fans. Anyone towards the front or anywhere close to the mic? Put your hand up. There's one there. We get a mic. And then, yes, we'll come to you. And then the one in the front. You could perhaps move closer to the... Sure. Let's get 2-3 questions. We'll take that one and then... Yes, go ahead.
Hello. Thinking about characters such as the oldest member in his reclusive spot in the Piccadilly, in your opinion, were the stories that he said is something that he experienced, or does he just make it up on the spot?
Oh, well, I think the point is it's deliberately left ambiguous. He tells great stories. Whether the stories were actually his experience or he's just telling a story, and often, of course, others are buying him drinks while he tells the story. So I think it's meant to be, you're meant to guess whether he was actually making them up or not. The point is it didn't matter, the story was always there.
Wodehouse called them frame stories because he would, episodic, he could make a book out of short stories with the same central character, like Mr. Mulliner, who has all these other relations, called Osbert Mulliner, for example, who takes a course on wood engraving from a correspondence school, and at the end of 6 months, he's very timid. He thinks wood engraving will make him more socially acceptable. And he knows nothing about wood engraving after 6 months. And he strides into the correspondence school and says, I know nothing at all about wood engraving after 6 months. I demand my money back. And the man looks at the book and says, oh, no, you've been taking a course on how to acquire a will of iron. And the proof that you have acquired a will of iron is here.
Okay, there's a question here.
You said that those who enjoy sarcasm and irony and have a sense of humor would love Wodehouse, but that India is, people in India are getting thin-skinned and they're lacking that sense of humor. Yet there's so many who still enjoy and appreciate Wodehouse's work. So what elements in his work or in his stories make them so relevant or relatable to Indian readers with respect to imagery, language, social construct, and his character developments?
Okay, that's a good question.
I wouldn't look for relevance in Wodehouse, really. I'd look
Well,
for
what resonates,
language,
perhaps, yeah.
I'd look for plotting, I'd look for an escape. I mean, in many ways, he offered you a wonderful escape from all the, pressures of homework or the sort of daily burdens of life. You're curling up with the Wodehouse was genuinely to exalt the spirit and take it into a different
Yes,
place.
Evelyn Moore
But
says
relevance
it's
would
Garden
not
of
have been a
Eden.
criteria.
Garden of Eden.
Swapan,
No,
resonance?
I don't think there's anything like socially useful knowledge in P.G. Wodehouse. I think you must disabuse yourself, read him as you would read Peter Pan, read him as you would read something else.
Surely you're forgetting that moment when one of his characters is working for the Mammoth Publishing Company, editing a book called Tiny Tots. And he answers one of his he says, now Uncle Wogley is going to put you onto a good thing. Find some sap and bet him that you can get more into a champagne bottle than is in the champagne bottle. And when you've found the sap, then turn the bottle upside down and run a little water into the groove at the bottom of the bottle, and you've got an easy fiver. This is for 5-year-old children.
Okay, one question there. And then there's
This
one.
question is for Philip. Since you've been talking about your association with Wodehouse, among all the series that he wrote, Smith, Lanning's Castle, the ones set in America, and all of his one-off novellas, which do you know, or if he ever expressed which one was his favorite character?
He quite often did say that it was Lord Emsworth, because Lord Emsworth was Wodehouse, tall and vague and pottering around, and always getting into the grip of more efficient people than he was, like the efficient Baxter, his secretary.
Okay, there's one question here and then one there. Let's take those both of those together. There's one in the...
This is something when I started reading Wodehouse early. Why are women characters in Wodehouse, for lack of better words, lame, gossipy, and simply waiting to get married? Ironically, the butler was much better. Were the women in in those times as such? Because, now...
Okay, about the women characters, that's fine. Let's take that question as well.
I
Go
mean,
ahead.
Don't
One
they
sec.
always get engaged rather than married?
Oh, they're waiting to get married, he says. They're waiting to get... Okay, wait, let's give you a second and then...
Yeah. So how do you think that the social commentary in Wodehouse's works, or the anti-establishment view he took, strongly set the tone for the political satirists who came after then, people like Jon Stewart, Carlin, Colbert, and the likes?
No, I wouldn't see any connection. Their humor is very different. In fact, Wodehouse was so much more subtle than any of these modern political satirists. In fact, Wodehouse didn't write political satire, so it's not even a fair comparison. But I wouldn't say there's any direct line of descent. the kind of humor that Wodehouse wrote really found very few imitators. I mean, imitation is a form of flattery. There was a writer in England called Richard Gordon who wrote the books called Doctor in the House, Doctor at Large, Doctor at Sea, and so on. In part seemed to be trying to imitate Wodehouse, but really a pale imitation. And there was similarly a writer called Henry Cecil who wrote about law in a kind of Woodhouseian style. But neither came anywhere close. I mean, I used to read them because I ran out of enough Wodehouse books to read. And so
Wodehouse loved Henry Cecil. He asked me to send him some Henry Cecil books, actually, afterwards.
oh, that's so interesting. I read a lot of Henry Cecil because he's a writer who reminded me most of Wodehouse, but not even a patch.
Philip, will you take the question though on the women characters? We got a question asking why do so many of them seem to be waiting to get married, and is that a reflection on social?
Well, there are two categories of young women. One is the tomboy, who's like the flapper, the 1920s, who's always getting Bertie into hot water by asking him to steal the autobiography manuscript of someone or do something. And the other one is the soupy, the Madeleine Bassett. Oh, Bertie, is this wise? When Bertie doesn't want anything to do with Madeleine Bassett. So really, he doesn't really recognize any other woman. Rather like the seaside postcards of Donald McGill, very much a part of the popular culture of this period. There are only two kinds of women in those postcards. There's a sort of, dreadful, nagging wife with a rolling pin, or there is a nubile young girl. There's nothing in between. He doesn't recognize it. He only really cared about Leonora, who was Ethel's daughter, who died after a routine surgical operation during the war while he was interned, in fact. And that, I suppose, was the greatest emotional blow that he suffered.
Yeah. So he said, I thought she was immortal. Yeah. He had the greatest book dedication of all time to her. To my daughter Leonora, without whose unfailing help and encouragement, this book would have been finished in half the time.
I'm slightly struck by this injection of anti-establishment dimension into Wodehouse. Now, unless you view it as sort of the celebration of toffs as being somehow more socialistic and a sort of robust attack on capitalism, on the other hand, it could be a celebration of toffery, if such a word could exist.
He's always really on the side of young people, actually.
Yeah.
There is a lot of satire. I mean, the great popular novelist for female readership at the time was Ethel M. Dell. Bingo Little marries a similar character called Rosie M. Banks. And lots of phrases from Ethel M. Dell keep creeping, like he rained kisses on her upturned face. But then another woman has a laugh which sounds like waves breaking on a stern rock-bound coast. That's one of the ones he's avoiding.
Or a squadron of cavalry clattering over a tin bridge.
That's right.
Oh my.
Somebody
Okay,
else's laugh.
young person with a mic. And then you can pass it to your neighbor.
Good evening. So my question is, after all these discussions, do you think at the end of the day, Wodehouse was just a pure romantic at heart since he wrote all these love stories in the end? Or was he just really sarcastic about love?
Oh. About? Love.
No, Philip Norman can answer, but I think he was quite sincere. But the point is really that for many of us, the stories, which were very often quite interchangeable, and the characters were quite interchangeable, most of them didn't have a third dimension. These were really cardboard cutout, walk-in, walk-off characters. What was wonderful was the plotting, the hilarity, the magnificent use of language, the allusions, the style, the flow. I mean, those things were what gave you pleasure far more than whether the guy gets the girl in the end. He always gets the girl in the end.
And he didn't seem to take himself too seriously. It's just, as a reader, you just feel like he didn't take himself too seriously.
The crucial thing to realize that he cared much more about animals than he did about humans. One of the features of my visit was to be taken to the Beiderwee home in Remsenburg, which Plummy and Ethel had endowed for stray cats. And I remember seeing him sort of cuddling a little kitten, it climbing up his bald head. He looked completely blissful at that moment. And he always had dogs, Pekingese dogs. And some of his greatest, actually he's written one of the great cat stories called The Story of Webster. About an artist's cat. It's another relation of Mr. Mulliner. An artist's cat, rather an artist who's asked to look after his uncle's cat, who is a bishop. He's going to become the bishop of Bongo Bongo in the South Sea Islands. And Webster comes to stay and is completely changes this artist. He makes him wear blue serge suits and gives him a disapproving eye when he brings his rackety young girlfriend home, until they accidentally spill a bottle of scotch. And when they look around, Webster is lapping at the scotch, and he gives Mulliner's nephew a wink, and Wodehouse says, he was, after all, one of the boys.
We forgot the pigs. The
pigs.
Celebration of the pigs. Not for the bacon.
Yes.
Okay.
Do you think there's a strong case for introducing Wodehouse in English education in India? Or do you think it requires a certain maturity of the mind to appreciate the genius in the language? Because I remember my textbooks, we had Nobel Prize winners, their writings, but I had the misfortune to be introduced to Wodehouse quite late in my life. So I was wondering why were we not introduced to Wodehouse in our...
Earlier on.
I discovered Wodehouse during what used to be called dictation class. I don't know if they still have them in school, but the teacher would read aloud a passage and you had to write it down with correct spellings, and your spellings would be corrected. And I was laughing so much during the dictation of this passage that after the period I went to the teacher and said, where was this passage from? And it was from The Indiscretions of Archie, which I then went and promptly borrowed from the library, and that's how I discovered Wodehouse. So I was 11 years old in class 7. It seems to me that there's no reason why children of a certain sensibility couldn't, in fact, read Wodehouse and benefit from it. The problem may be that in our school system, the uneven level of fluency of students could be a problem, that some would get a lot out of it and some would end up perhaps, trying to take things too literally and get somewhat confused. Certainly, I would be in favor.
Speaking personally, I graduated to Wodehouse after devouring all the William books. Because I thought it was a logical progression from there, and I still read the William books, which will
Precocious children, really.
Yeah, precocious children and precocious adults.
John Lennon the same.
Formidable arts.
And witty language.
Okay, I think this is the last question. Go for it.
Yeah, simple question. I would like to know each of the panelists' favorite Wodehouse character and why.
Oh, good question. I should have invented that one. Okay, go for it. Swapan, favorite character?
Undeniably Lord Emsworth. Undeniably.
And why?
Because I love the idea of an old man living in a world of his own, completely irritated by what's going on around him, completely unmindful of that, and basically pottering around. I love pottering personally, and I can identify with the idea of Lord Emsworth.
Shashi?
He's taken away an answer that I might have been tempted to give. But the truth is that I didn't really play favorites that much. There was a character called Eucridge, collections of stories. He was very resourceful, very clever. He was interesting. But I suppose if you really want a memorable character, because so many of the heroes of the novels were completely sort of interchangeable cardboard types, as I mentioned, you'd have to look for characters who really were sort of out of the ordinary, even if you didn't always approve of their behavior. And that's where the uncle Galahad, Galahad Threepwood would probably be the name that comes to mind, precisely because he was so outrageous in his behavior, but got such a zest for life and got so much out of it. I suppose that would probably be the one. But I've got nothing against Bertie Wooster or Smith or Smith with a silent P, as in ptarmigan. As in Tithys or
indeed against Aunt Agatha.
It's Wodehouse himself was searching for a character that he could use again and again. He used to queue up on Dulwich railway station platform every week for the Strand magazine because Sherlock Holmes stories were running, and queues were forming every week to get the latest Holmes story. And he tried many. I mean, the Eucridge that you mentioned is one that probably doesn't translate, because Eucridge is a sort of shambolic confidence trickster who wears spectacles held together with ginger beer wire. Now, old ginger beer bottles had a cap held by wire. That is not going to translate. He finally found, in 1915, he found Bertie, actually it was Reggie Pepper was going to be Bertie Wooster's original name. But, and in this, the first one he sold to the Saturday Evening Post for what he called a hotsy 15 grand was something called Something Fresh. And that is in such a long tradition of a knowing valet and an idiotic employer. If you go back to Mr. Pickwick and Sam Weller, even back to Don Quixote and Sancho Panza, and yet we never think of any of those people with Bertie. The idea of going back to the old flat for a snifter before pushing round to the drones for a spot of dinner still allures me, actually, after all these years.
Did Jeeves describe him as of having negligible intellect in one of the asides?
Yes, actually, Bertie discovers that Jeeves belongs to a club called the Junior Ganymede Club, where all the other valets and butlers enter comments on their employers, and he is described as mentally negligible. Hard words, of course, but no doubt perfectly true.
Okay, apparently
there's one particular thing which might explain the ridiculousness of the whole enterprise. One line from Wodehouse, I think it was Wooster who sort of said, "Oh, I once knew a chap who had a job."
Okay, we do have to end on that note. I want to thank all of you. Please do join us in thanking our panelists and thank the excellent volunteers of the festival who've been helping us throughout. Thanks for coming.
Thank you very much, Philip Norman, Shashi Tharoor, Swapan Dasgupta, and Amrita Tripathi. We would also thank our sponsors